Welcome back. Well, with the COVID-19 pandemic hitting New York particularly hard, there has been an increase in homeless individuals, particularly millennials seeking shelter across New York City. Aside from seeking shelter services, millennial adults are also staying in shelters longer than the time that's usually allotted by the city. Now, the pandemic has been particularly challenging for the homeless because they're unable to self-quarantine, cannot social distance in a crowded shelter, and less than adequate services for health care. So joining us to talk a little bit further and give us some insight more into the homeless population is the program director of a family homeless shelter, Dr. Xellex Rivera. And we thank you for joining us, Dr. Rivera.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. And so listen, when we talk about homelessness across New York City, obviously a lot of people will often look at the adult population. But like we said, when it comes to millennials, that's a huge population for homelessness as well.
Correct. So a lot of times when you look at research or the data, you'll notice that it's only on youth or runaways, or it's on adults, like elderly adults, anybody over 50. But there's very little research, especially in New York City, as it relates to the young adult, more millennial generation who is 30 to 40 years old. And you'll come to see that a lot of them have entered shelter trying to start over or seek a new beginning or seek independence. However, they end up staying in shelter much longer than the allotted time given by the city.
Yeah. And so when we look at this, I mean, obviously it's got to be a challenge for the city. Give us your assessment of how you see, the homeless problem and projects that are going on in the city.
So there's 3 different divisions in New York City of homelessness. So there are single adult shelters, there are family shelters with children, and then there are single adult shelters. So it can vary amongst the divisions. However, for the most part, everybody's focus is the housing first model to move them out of shelter as quickly as possible. However, a lot of times you'll notice when engaging clients is that they're not necessarily prepared to go back into the community. So even if they end up getting a job at $15 an hour, they're still not prepared for the other components outside of paying rent, Con Edison, groceries, transportation. So the $15 an hour minimum wage rate will not sustain that person, whether they're single or if they're a family. So they end up staying in shelter, trying to utilize some of the city's resources to exit. And even sometimes that can become challenging because a lot of times the city's resources do not match the cost of living in New York City. It can match certain areas, but it does not match overall the cost of living in New York City. So that's always their challenge.
Yeah. And I know you do a lot of advocacy, particularly in regards to the homeless and those particularly homeless millennials. What would you like to see, or what can we do to better this situation? Because like I told people, when we talk about social justice really centers around this particular topic right here, because there's a lot of people who are in communities of color who really deal with this homeless issue on a daily basis.
Correct. So there's no real cure for homelessness, as a lot of people tend to think of. However, I think that when they enter the shelter system, if we're meeting them on individual basis and not as a collective group, then you'll be better equipped to engage those clients. Some clients do come in, let's say, with mental illness or drug addictions, but some clients just come in because, they had a slum landlord that happened to get them out illegally. So there's always a good variation of the client that you might see. However, if I could make an ideal program, I would make it more comprehensive to where that you're overcoming all of the barriers of that person. So whether it's mental health, drugs, family reunification, childcare, like you're overcoming every barrier before you even consider them actively searching for housing. However, right now in our system, we don't do that. So as soon as you enter shelter, we get you stable within 30 days to say, okay, you're good, you're clean, you're eating, you've opened all the necessary public assistance cases. However, that's it. Then we're focused on housing. Go get a job, save your money. However, being homeless is a form of trauma that's impacted. Some of them were street homeless before they came into shelter. Some of them were just, couch surfing, as they like to call it. Some of them are DV victims. Like there's so many variations. So by the time they get this stable place that is temporary shelter, they need more than 30 days to just breathe and then go to therapy and process, between going from the park bench now to living in a shelter. So all those kind of things have to be addressed long before you start to tell the person, okay, it's time for you to get a voucher and for you to move out. So I think if I could make an ideal system, it would approach the client on an individual basis and give them more comprehensive services.
Yeah. What are we missing when it comes to that millennial population? Because to think about a millennial being homeless today, that's like, no, that's not in our forefront of our mind. I think a lot of people have stereotypes as to what the homeless population looks like. But we have a lot of what's called the working poor across New York City, and millennials actually fall into that category.
Correct. The crazy part is the stereotype of the homeless person is the person you might see like in a subway station or panhandling on the street. But actually a large majority of a homeless population across all divisions look just like me and you and everybody else. They're not necessarily panhandling and on the streets. The thing that we're missing with the millennial generation is that we're assuming that because this generation had opportunities to go to college and should have completed college, that they should be better off. However, one of the things in my research was that they're not necessarily better off because they have more financial debt and they're coming home to live with their parents. And ultimately, they're choosing not to leave their parent, or if they do choose, now they're choosing shelter as an alternative because that's their way of finding independence. So we're missing the whole point of just assuming they should be good. You went to college or some college, you should get a better paying job. But in New York City, between the job market and then the housing market, even if they have some college or full college, they still cannot sustain living in New York City. So that is the hardest part to understand. And, on some spectrum of the characteristics, they tend not to ask for help as freely. However, once they get help, they will continue the process at that point. So it's again, a wide spectrum of things.
Are we seeing any trends with regards to why people end up being homeless? Is it because can't afford rent? Is it because of evictions? What are we seeing as some common threads in homelessness?
So common threads would be homeless eviction is big on the family side. Sometimes families, especially with children, they'll probably get evicted because they can no longer afford to pay the rent. On the single side, you might see a more increased level of drug abuse or mental illness. So it'll vary depending on whatever division that person is coming from or working on. But for the most part, most of the themes are drug abuse, family reunification. Some people got put out, so they could not longer stay there. They were squatting or there was not enough space. So they were put out of that place, which is not a formal eviction, but basically the person did not have enough space. But for the most part, it's mental illness, drug abuse, either evictions, domestic violence, or they were just completely put out of their house of residence, maybe with their family or friend.
And what about, I know the courts are filled with with cases about housing court, and a lot of people, especially after COVID-19, have been given a reprieve. Do you estimate that given COVID-19 and what's happening right now, that we could possibly see an increase in the homeless population, given the fact of so many people out there, 22 million across America, unemployed or filing their first unemployment. And we know a large chunk of that is coming right out of our state.
So I think initially there will not be a dramatic increase, but it will begin to incline because, if they've gotten, the unemployment benefits here were relatively good in New York State. So they might be able to sustain, but after a while, they might not. A lot of jobs have let people go after a furlough. I've had a couple of clients that initially were furloughed, but then once it hit 3 months of COVID, they're now completely terminated or laid off. So I think that there will be an increase, especially amongst families with children when the housing courts open back up. So I know a lot of people were told not to pay their rent or to pay their rent, like it was kind of in limbo. Mm-hmm. So I think that will increase the amount of evictions as soon as we open the courts back up.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about your work. Obviously you're very tied into the homeless situation, the homeless population. Give us a little bit about what you do.
So I've been in residential settings or shelter settings for 10 years, believe it or not. I started my career on the single side in single division of shelter services, and I kind of work my way up to the families with children under 18 division. I'm passionate about it because they just need hope. I think a lot of times, and I was one of these persons as well, who believed that the homeless person was only the person panhandling on a subway or on the corner. It wasn't until I actually started working in shelter that I was able to see that the person looks just like me and they just had a bad hiccup, or, eviction, or, sometimes landlords increase rent. All of these kind of factors came into play. Through my work, I've come to the realization that we're not meeting the clients where they are, even though we like to say that we are. We're focused on numbers and statistics, and, we got to get them back out, but there's also a lot of recidivism. So you might get them back out and give them a program, let's say, that gives them 1 year of rent or even 5 years of rent, and then they're still not internally stable to survive in New York City. So even after the voucher runs out, I've had hundreds of clients who've come back. They're like, okay, my voucher ran out, I'm back. I still don't know what to do. So that is when I started to, most of my research focuses on meeting the client and understanding what they're going through. There are people who, especially in family shelters, you have clients that come in here. Yes, let's say they have 2, 3, 4, 5 children, but that does not mean she knows how to cook. That does not mean that she knows how to clean. And therefore it keeps her stagnant longer because she's unable to, provide for her children. And that's her main focus. And then housing is like, 3rd or 4th on the list. So if we start to, my advocacy really comes from, if we can look at them as people and then address all of their barriers, because housing is not the only barrier, it is just one of their barriers. And we need to start looking at that as a whole. So that's where my passion and advocacy came from.
Yeah. Talk to me about vouchers. I mean, critics have said that the voucher system works, but also at the same time, it's not enough. Talk to me about what your perspective is with regards to the vouchers, and are people getting enough? We talked about recidivism. Is it due to the fact that they're not getting enough?
So the voucher amounts typically do not match the cost of living in New York City. They're following, I believe, federal lines as it relates to poverty. So for example, if I have a family here that is a 1 and 2, which means it's 1 adult, 2 children, and they end up with a voucher for $1,580, that means they need to find a 1 or 2 bedroom in a borough for $1,580. And that's not really likely to even find a 1 bedroom at this point for $1,500. So, and they cannot add to those vouchers. So let's say they can afford to give more on top of the voucher, they're unable to do that. So that's one reason why they're unable to move out. Then if they do move out, they'll probably exhaust the voucher, and then they're not prepared moving forward. So there's a couple of vouchers, and the city, I would applaud the city on that point, that they've created all of these avenues for people to have vouchers to move out. It's just that the vouchers are not matching New York City's rent. So that becomes the issue. As it relates to recidivism, once the voucher runs out, a lot of times either they're not prepared to take on the rent after that point, or the rent increases significantly. So if you get a landlord who, let's say, took the voucher at $1,580, and then the voucher has now run out after a year or so, then they'll just increase their rent back to whatever the market value is, which might be now $2,300. And the client is unable to pay that amount of money, especially if they're still maintaining minimum wage jobs to survive. So they end up coming back to shelter and trying to get another voucher to do that whole process over. There are actually selective parts of New York City that you think about in shelter to place clients because they're more affordable. Like the Bronx. The Bronx is actually one of the boroughs that are considered to be more affordable. Therefore, you end up placing more shelter families or clients in the Bronx as it is.
Yeah. And I've also said the crime, if you will, the crime is the fact that you have these vouchers. And as you said, the rent market continues to go up. And so it's almost like you are serving somebody a recipe for disaster. When you give them a voucher, the rent market continues to go up. And it's almost like, well, we're going to see you again, because there's no way that you're going to be able to navigate this because the numbers just don't add up.
Right. And that's, I hope that's not really their thought process, but that is kind of how it goes. You exit, and even like when you think of smaller families, they exit on a voucher that's $1,323. If you can really find an apartment anywhere in New York City, even the Bronx, at $1,323 at a 1 bedroom, you'll be pretty successful. So all of these people end up going out and then it's supposed to include utilities. But if it doesn't, then that person now is paying through their voucher. And even with the voucher, families have a portion to pay. So even though the voucher is $13.23, depending on how HRA budgets their account, they might end up still paying, whether it's $200, $300, $400, $500 of the $13.23. So then the city ends up paying a portion, then the client pays a portion as well in regards to that voucher. So then if they can no longer sustain that, then they end up right back in shelter trying to start the whole process over again. But a lot of our clients also look to NYCHA for housing opportunities as well. So they always frequently try to apply for public housing.
Yeah. All right, we're going to leave it there. Dr. Xellex Rivera, got to bring you back. You can definitely give us an understanding as to how things are progressing, especially after we get a little bit further in the phase process in COVID. Love to have you come back and share with us.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
All righty, Dr. Xellex Rivera here with us here. Listen, want you to stay with us. We do have more show coming up. We are going to be right back coming up right after